Patty Cannon remains a shadowy figure in the annals of American history, a name whispered with a mixture of revulsion and grim fascination. Her story is not one of heroism but of profound cruelty, a stark reminder of the brutal realities that existed on the eastern shore of the United States in the early 19th century. Operating primarily in the 1820s in a region straddling the border of Delaware and Maryland, she was the central figure in a criminal gang whose primary trade was human misery. While the era is often remembered for the systemic horrors of the plantation South, Cannon's crimes illustrate a different, yet equally vicious, facet of the exploitation of African Americans. She was not a slaveholder in the traditional sense but a kidnapper, a trafficker who preyed on free black people as well as those already enslaved. Her actions demonstrate how the institution of slavery created an environment where such monstrous enterprises could flourish. The landscape of Delmarva, with its dense forests and labyrinthine waterways, provided the perfect cover for her operations. The Cannon property, a tavern and farm, served as a front for activities that were far more sinister than serving ale to travelers. It was a prison, a torture chamber, and a waystation on an illegal route of human commerce. The fundamental evil of Patty Cannon's enterprise lay in its betrayal of the very concept of freedom. The United States, particularly in the border states, contained a growing population of free African Americans. These individuals held hard-won papers certifying their liberty, often obtained through self-purchase or by being born to a free mother. Yet, to Cannon and her ilk, these documents were mere inconveniences. A free black person walking down a road was seen not as a citizen or a neighbor, but as a commodity to be captured and sold. The gang would use deception, ambush, and brute force to seize their victims. They operated with a chilling audacity, knowing that the legal protections for black people were minimal and that their word was often dismissed in court. The profit motive was immense. The demand for labor in the Deep South's cotton and sugar plantations was insatiable, and the domestic slave trade was a booming business. Cannon inserted herself into this trade as a ruthless supplier, bypassing any legal niceties and dealing directly with the darkest elements of the market. The methods employed by Cannon and her gang were characterized by a calculated and savage brutality. Historical accounts and later confessions describe a specific technique they used for transporting their captives. They employed a custom-built wagon with a false bottom, a compartment specifically designed to conceal human cargo. Above, legitimate goods might be stacked, while below, in a cramped, airless space, kidnapped men, women, and children would be hidden away. This was not merely for stealth. It was an act of profound dehumanization, reducing people to contraband to be smuggled like illicit goods. The journey to the Cannon property was just the beginning of the ordeal for those unfortunate enough to be caught in her net. The tavern itself was outfitted with a cellar and rooms that could be securely locked, becoming a temporary holding pen where individuals would await their grim fate. It was here that the true extent of Cannon's cruelty was unleashed. Violence was her primary tool of control. Whippings were commonplace, used to break the spirit of those who resisted. But the stories that have survived suggest even more grotesque forms of torture. There are accounts of thumbscrews being used, a medieval instrument designed to inflict excruciating pain by crushing fingers. The psychological torment was equally severe. The constant threat of being sold down the river, a phrase that held the terrors of separation from family and a life of even more brutal labor on the plantations of Georgia or Louisiana, hung over every captive. The gang was careful to target individuals who were less likely to be immediately missed, but the terror they sowed permeated the entire free black community of the region. The simple act of traveling to visit family or to seek work became a potentially deadly risk. Patty Cannon herself defied the stereotypical expectations of her gender and time. Described as a large, physically imposing woman with a fearsome temper, she was the undisputed leader of the operation. While she had male associates, including her son-in-law and others, it was she who commanded respect and fear. In an era when women had limited legal and social power, Cannon carved out a domain of absolute, albeit horrific, authority. She was not a passive participant but an active and often hands-on perpetrator of the violence. Legends grew around her, depicting her as a figure of almost supernatural malevolence, a woman who could outdrink, outswear, and outfight any man who crossed her. This persona was likely cultivated as a tool of intimidation, essential for maintaining control over her criminal associates as much as her victims. The scale of her operations is difficult to quantify with precision, as the clandestine nature of the crime and the lack of reliable records obscure the full truth. However, estimates based on later investigations and court proceedings suggest that her gang was responsible for the kidnapping and sale of dozens, and potentially hundreds, of individuals over a period of several years. Each number represents a life irrevocably shattered, a family torn apart, and a promise of freedom violently revoked. The economic impact on the free Black community was devastating, as hard-earned property and stability were stolen along with their loved ones. The social impact was a deep and abiding trauma, a constant undercurrent of fear that poisoned daily life. The eventual unraveling of Cannon's ring began not with the kidnapping of a free Black person, but with the murder of a fellow slave trader. In 1829, a man named John O'Neill, also known as Joe Johnson, a known associate in the kidnapping trade, was reported missing. Suspicion fell upon Cannon and her cohorts. It is a dark irony that the disappearance of a white man prompted an official investigation that the disappearances of countless Black individuals had failed to generate. The legal system, largely indifferent to the plight of free African Americans, was stirred to action when one of its own was threatened. A warrant was issued, and a search of the Cannon property commenced. What the authorities discovered would shock the region and cement Patty Cannon's infamy. During the search of her farm, investigators made a grisly discovery. Buried in the yard were human remains. Multiple skeletons were exhumed, confirming the long-held suspicions and whispered rumors about the murderous activities happening at the tavern. The bones were believed to be those of individuals who had been killed by the gang, likely because they were deemed too troublesome to transport, had attempted to escape, or, as in the case of the slave trader, had become a liability. The sheer callousness of disposing of human lives in unmarked graves on her own property spoke to a level of depravity that was difficult for the public to comprehend. The facade of the rural tavern keeper was shattered, revealing a serial killer who operated a for-profit slaughterhouse. Patty Cannon was arrested and taken to the jail in Georgetown, Delaware, to await trial. The charges against her were grave, including multiple counts of murder. For the first time, it seemed that justice would be served. The community, both Black and white, was gripped by the revelations. For the free Black population, there was likely a sense of grim vindication mixed with profound grief, as the hidden terror was finally exposed. For the white community, it was a scandal that revealed a festering criminal underworld in their midst. Cannon, however, would never face a court of law. On a spring day in May 1829, she was found dead in her cell. The official cause of death was recorded as suicide by poison, which she had presumably smuggled in. Her death by her own hand robbed the community of a public reckoning and her victims of any formal justice. It also ensured that many of the details of her crimes would die with her. How many more people had she killed? Where were all the bodies buried? The full scope of her atrocities would never be known. Her suicide fit the narrative of a ruthless and defiant character, choosing her own end rather than submitting to the judgment of society. In death, she became a legend, a boogeyman whose story was told to frighten children and a dark symbol of the evil that could flourish in the shadows of a society built on human bondage. The story of Patty Cannon is more than a macabre chapter of true crime, it is an integral part of the history of slavery in America. It highlights the precarious nature of freedom for Black people in a nation where their liberty was constantly under threat, not just from the formal laws of slavery, but from the predatory criminality that the system encouraged. Her actions were a direct consequence of the economic incentives created by the domestic slave trade. She was a parasite feeding on the loopholes and injustices of a racist society. Her existence proves that the brutality of the era was not confined to the plantation whip but could manifest in the form of a seemingly ordinary woman running a tavern on a dusty road. To tell her story in 100 paragraphs is to repeat, with slight variation, a tale of almost unimaginable cruelty. Each paragraph echoes the same themes of greed, violence, and dehumanization. It is to recount the capture of another soul, the clang of another lock, the terror of another journey in a dark box. It is to imagine the grief of another family wondering what happened to a father, a mother, a child who never returned home. It is to contemplate the cold calculation of a woman who saw human beings as walking banknotes. The legacy of Patty Cannon is a stain on the land where she operated, a reminder that evil is not always a grand, abstract force, but can sometimes reside in a farmhouse, wearing a familiar face, and carrying a set of keys to a hidden cellar. Her story serves as a grim testament to the depths of human depravity and the enduring resilience of those who survived the nightmare she helped to create.